This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to another edition of BreakPoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, I think for many Americans, we're coming up now on a month of lockdown or quarantine or whatever you want to call it. And there have been some good jokes, I got to say, some good parody videos, just attempting to keep our spirits light and to pass the time. And I think my favorite so far has been the mom and the dad and their kids that got together and they sang a parody of the VeggieTales silly song, The Pirates Who Don't Do Anything. And it was the family who doesn't do anything.
You just revealed your deep-seated evangelical, I was going to say heritage, but there's a word for, bona fides.
What's heritage? Come on.
Bona fides. No, bona fides.
Yeah, bona fides.
That is legit.
Go.
If you think about life through VeggieTales, I was thinking more of the one where the husband posted and said, my wife and I, we've had such a wonderful conversation about all the things I've done wrong for the last 15 years. Or I think it was, we've been able to catch up on all the wrong things I've done for the last 15 years. So that's a little bit more cynical. But I had more kind of neo-fundamentalist bona fides, which is a little bit different than the VeggieTale bona fides.
Okay. So you did not see Larry Boy live at Raymond James Stadium or anything like that?
Man, I was older. I went to now here's my bona fides. I went to the first Christian rock concert at Liberty University. And this was a big deal because there was no Christian rock. We knew right. Christian music was good and rock music was bad, but Christian rock music, who knew what to do with, right, for a long time. It was really a confusing time for all of us. And I just remember Kim Boyce, who, by the way, Kim Boyce was the concert. And it was scandalous because people were dancing at the concert. And by that, I mean they were swaying back and forth with the one step. And that's about as far as it got, really. And second, she was Miss Florida. And that, as a junior high boy, is what I remember.
Not leaving room for the Holy Spirit. There are so many Baptist jokes I could drop right here, but it would not be kosher, so I'll leave them aside. John, the thing is, we have these distractions and these diversions and these good attempts to sort of bring ourselves out of the doldrums of lockdown in the midst of this, and it sort of strikes a contrast of a really just a harsh contrast with the facts on the ground that 50,000 people have died from this virus in the U.S. right now. And our stories this week, I think, really are dominated by what's happening, what people are doing with this time and with the questions that this time has raised about what our lives together as families and communities should look like, and then what America is going to look like when we reopen. And it may very well be a different country. And that's a discussion you and I have kind of had over the course of this week.
Yeah, and we're all making it up. And that's the one thing I keep coming back to this week is we are now starting to think about what the future is going to be like. Are changes going to be temporary or changes going to be permanent? And I think the answer to that is yes. There's probably going to be both. And we'll talk more about that probably here as the program progresses here. But also, I think that there's good news this week. I mean, we saw, far fewer infections, even in Spain, which was on the way up. They've now had a few days of kind of quote unquote flattening the curve. And you've had these kind of, real conversations about what is this stair step. And of course, at the same time, you've got the protests and you've got the protests that are at some level, led by the extremists on both sides. We should still be locked down until there's no sickness whatsoever. On the other side, we should completely open up. And this whole thing has been, really overblown. And then you've got a bunch of governors and people around several states in the South, even in Colorado here over the weekend. We'll do a graduated, another level of businesses now that can be open. The social distancing is still on, the limits of gatherings over 10. But hair salons, and I've got a very, very good friend who has a really cool barbershop here in Colorado Springs. This has been financially just devastating for them. And then, of course, we also saw the unintended consequences of government help this week, where interesting article about how the small business owner was able to receive some of the payroll protection funds, and her employees were actually mad because they could actually make more money as individuals from unemployment than they could by staying employed. Wow. And then you have this idea of long-term thinking versus short-term thinking and, investing in the good. And this is all a mess. And I said on my point commentary on Friday, that, if you have a nickel for all the times you see the word unprecedented, in a headline or in an article, we'd all be rich. We'd have all the money to pay back the stimulus. And at the same time, it is. And I think one of the things that I'm really drawn to this week is humility. I've got ideas about where things are going and how things should act, but we're making this up, and there needs to be at least a little bit of grace given. And one of the stories we wanted to jump into was an example of no grace given.
Absolutely no grace.
No grace, as millions and millions more people. In fact, this is my favorite coronavirus, pun, which is, Oprah saying, you get to homeschool and you get to homeschool and you get to homeschool. And Harvard apparently thinks this is a risk to national security.
Yeah. We had an article in Harvard Magazine this past week. It was actually a summary of the arguments from a recent Arizona Law Review paper by Harvard law professor Elizabeth Bartholet. And it calls for what she describes as a presumptive ban on homeschooling. And I don't know if we've mentioned this before on the show, but my listeners have probably gathered by now. The listeners have probably surmised that I was, in fact, homeschooled.
And I'm a homeschool dad, but I was not homeschooled, which is why I'm the one on this program giving all the sports references week after week.
And that's why your social sense is so immensely advanced beyond mine, John. And I'm learning every day. I'm trying to come out of my shell and become a more integrated member of society. But this paper was just, an atrocity. Bartholet argues that homeschooling not only violates children's rights to what she calls a meaningful education and their right to be protected from potential child abuse, but may keep them from contributing positively to a democratic society. And
wait. Read that last one again, because that in and of itself was like, you talk about that escalated quickly.
It may keep them from contributing positively to a democratic society. But her real complaint seems to be, as you read on in the paper, she really shows her cards, and that is that many religious families are homeschooling for the purpose of teaching their kids their convictions, for passing on their faith to their children. And this to her is horrifying because children, she says, have a right to exposure to alternative worldviews.
Yeah, let's stop right there, because this is the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Look, first of all, I'm glad she knows the word worldview. Let's start there.
Yeah, that's a quote.
That is a quote. And secondly, really? So at public schools across America, there is an honest reckoning of different worldviews? Like, I was scheduled to speak at 9 homeschool events this year. They've mostly all been canceled, so we went online with a couple of them. But these are events I've spoken at for years. And I meet these people. And every session that I get is an exposure to alternate worldviews, recognizing that there is a worldview perspective that I and many of the others in the audience are coming from as we engage secularism and as we engage postmodernism, both in its kind of fundamental foundational aspects as well as its application in society. Which public school curriculum really walks through alternative worldviews? Which public school curriculum actually does that? Now, I say curriculum because I know public school teachers who do. I've got former students who do that. In fact, I heard from one of them this week in a really thoughtful comment. And I once met an honors English teacher that walked me through how she uses Charles Dickens versus 1984 versus, something else. She had 3 ways where basically she was going through pantheism, theism, and naturalism. In fact, as an advocate for Christian education, even at the higher level, I tell parents this all the time. Look, there's 2 schools that I think you need to think really hard before you send your students to in college. The first is a formally Christian college, particularly one that's gone quickly to the left, because their intent is to run away from their founding. And because they run away from their founding, you don't really get a good education. You get an anti-conservative education. The other is as a secular university where, other than outstanding professors that we see dotted throughout the landscape of, public universities. And there are many of them that we work with and we talk about here on our programs all the time. Yeah, but by and large, it's assumed that there's one way. It's assumed that secularism is the truth.
Well, that's the assumption that's so evident in
throughout this
piece. And John Hirschauer at National Review has this great critique of the original paper where he points out that Bartholet is essentially assuming her worldview and the secular outlook on things is the default worldview, that it's just the neutral truth that children have to then learn. They have to be forced to learn that. And parents are forbidden from keeping their kids home and actually teaching them any alternative. And the opposite is not true. he says. You will not see her demanding that children in secular and atheist households be taken for a number of hours each day to be instructed in religious thinking, because she's treating her worldview as the assumed neutral ground. But it's not. And just knowing that you have a worldview is so crucial to education.
Yeah, that's at the foundation of a worldview education, is realizing you have one. This isn't something that you might not have. It's something that you have. The question is how coherent and consistent are you being? But this article was really taken apart, and Bartholet's work was really taken apart on a number of levels by all kinds of folks. I thought the National Review piece was great. We'll link to that on the show notes. But also Alex Harris, one of the Harris brothers, known for his book, basically helping a generation of teenagers skip adolescence.
Yeah, do hard things. It was
and it's tremendous. And of course, here's the thing. Never took a formal test until he actually went to college and left that college and went to Harvard Law and clerked for a Supreme Court justice, by the way, and then went on now to work at a large law firm. So there were actually 2 Harvard homeschool grads that took Bartholet to the woodshed. And I say that, and they really did. And you talk about the assumption of which one is normal. I mean, Bartholet's argument that children who are homeschooled aren't protected from potential child abuse cites the statistics that have been brought up, although she admits, and it's unclear, how to draw any sort of kind of trends across these lines. For example, there was a story in California where a lesbian couple drove their children off a cliff last year, and the headline was that they were homeschooled, not lesbian. So who knows? I mean, I'm not saying it's because they were lesbian, but why would you say...
Who do you want to incriminate? Which association do you want to make?
Yeah, and what the real answer was when this story came out is that it was a significant mental illness reflected both in one of the partners and so on.
Because nothing bad ever happens in public schools.
Well, that's the thing, is the rates are tremendous. We've spent so much time talking about the abuse, the horrific abuse in the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, it's systemic and it goes way back. But as Benjamin Weicker has written, you flesh it out and the rates within public schools are disastrous. And we talked about that on our BreakPoint on this past week. But also, Shane, we talked about those who experience abuse at the hands of teachers and supervisors and so on. And you look at it and it's a dramatic number of public school teachers who do a great job and they try their hardest to do it, and they're not guilty of anything like this. And every single instance of child abuse is horrific. But what's not mentioned in those statistics too is the student on student sexual abuse that takes place in so many schools. And that's something too that just gets brought to the forefront. But as many people has essentially destroyed this whole thesis and did it from top to bottom and really obliterated any sort of credibility I think Bartholet has. The question is this nut picking? Is this kind of one example, or is this part of something more systemic that is going to threaten parental rights? I think there's always a threat to parental rights in the world, first of all. Secondly, in a growing secular context, there's going to be a real debate, because historically, in any sort of secular context, there has been a debate between, do kids belong to the state? Are they primarily citizens, or are they primarily children? Do they belong to the family or the state primarily?
Well, now, the primarily citizens argument is up front, not only with Bartholet, but with her colleagues. I mean, we're talking about this nut picking. First of all, this is a professor at Harvard Law. Okay, this is not some tiny liberal arts college somewhere. This is Harvard Law.
Right.
And second, Bartholet is one of 10 speakers scheduled to address Harvard Law School's homeschooling summit in June. I don't know how that's going to happen, maybe over Zoom, or maybe the lockdown will be over by then. But the event was organized by William and Mary Law Professor James Dwyer, who's openly said that the reason parent-child relationships exist in the first place is because the state confers legal parenthood. So that assumption is just out in the open for this school.
But that's why this is all about worldview again, because if you dig down past the surface and, Bartholet's, subject of choice and her arguments of choice to support her subject of choice, it fundamentally goes to what is the government? Is the government's responsibility to confer rights, as Dwyer says, or is it to recognize rights? Is there something that's more realistic than what a community decides for itself. In other words, when we talk about things like marriage and parenthood and things like that, are we talking about something like traffic laws, things that we impose on the created order in order to bring safety and order? Or are we talking about something like gravity? In other words, something that exists in and of itself. And for the record, two things about that homeschooling summit. Number one is I really want to go, but it's invite only. And I am trying very hard to get that invite, but I don't know whether that's going to happen. So if anybody wants to hook me up, I'd love to be there at this event. And second, if you look at the other list of speakers, there's a lot of former homeschoolers. And that's a real recent phenomenon, too, about homeschoolers who had bad experiences. And let's acknowledge up front, there are homeschoolers who have had tremendously bad experiences. And I have been in that world where I've seen some of the reasons for those experiences. And it's Pharisaism, it's fundamentalism, it's anti-education. That stuff does exist. But a lot of these, by the way, are gay, lesbian, transgender students who did not get the support for their lifestyle choices from their parents. And anyway, just a point for everyone to note.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit BreakPoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on BreakPoint this week talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, one of the types of stories that we deal with frequently here on the show is international persecution. You know, we try to remember our persecuted brothers and sisters overseas. And one of the developing stories, or two of the big developing stories here have been, China, which is a totalitarian communist government persecuting Christians there. And then in Africa, Nigeria specifically, there is this ongoing wave of more guerrilla, less organized and centralized persecution by Islamic extremists that has it's like a slow motion genocide, I think is the right word. And someone at Providence Magazine this past week just described it that way. And that's the right word. 35,000 deaths there. Since 2015, consisting mainly of, hit and run raids by Islamic extremists on civilians, on women and children. People are still missing. This slow motion genocide is one of those disasters I think that nobody seems to care about internationally in the present, but then we're going to look back on it after the fact, almost like a Darfur on a smaller scale kind of thing. It's going to be something that we look back on in the history books and remember as a terrible moment for Christians internationally. And it's just heartbreaking and gut-wrenching to watch.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the trends that we have seen throughout history is that instability is often used as an opportunity for evil. When the cat is looking the other way, the mice play, right? And this happens all the time. We know it happens with our own kids. But when you're talking about kind of ideologically committed jihadists, then the opportunity that has been presented. I mean, the story of Nigeria, by the way, is already a story of opportunism where jihadis were allowed to do their thing in the name of land disputes. And now that we have lockdowns and stay-at-home orders even in Africa, and we also have the eye of the West even further off Nigeria. And let's be clear, this is not something that the West has paid enough attention to. I think Open Doors called Nigeria the most dangerous place on the planet to be a Christian right now, which if people have been following what we've been talking about China, that's saying a lot, because China, by the way, is using this same sort of instability as an opportunism to continually make sure that nobody puts Jesus ahead of Xi Jinping. So this is something that, again, we're going to look back on, and it's going to be a devastating reality when we pull our heads up from this coronavirus and look across at what happened to our brothers and sisters in the other part of the world.
I think this is also a reminder of the fact that we are truly the same church that we were in the first and second and third century. This is the same world, and we face the same adversary. And these sorts of persecutions are exactly what Jesus promised would come. But there's also something hopeful that you can take even out of this tragedy, I think, and it's looking at the perseverance of Christians in these hot spots of persecution. And seeing the next Christendom, seeing the birth of something that was born in Europe almost 2,000 years ago with the persecutions under the Romans. And you look at Boko Haram, for instance, and the atrocities they perpetrated against Christian communities in Africa. I kind of see the Colosseum and the lions. And while I pray for deliverance, and I can't imagine being in that circumstance, I'm also praying that Christianity would triumph there, that the witness of these martyrs and these brave brothers and sisters would ultimately result in the overthrow of the evil ideologies that are persecuting them, that are leading to so much destruction.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time, would it? And that's the hope of the gospel, where Christian faithfulness has overcome persecution. But going back to that theme of the opportunism, the other thing we're seeing, if we go from there to here, also keeping in the same theme as slaughter and opportunism, is what we're seeing in the abortion industry. The Michigan governor defended keeping abortion clinics open as essential services during the lockdown because, quote, abortions are, and she literally called it life-sustaining. I mean, there's times when you hear abortion advocates say these things and you just kind of wonder, that's unbelievable. I mean, I don't even understand how you can say that with a straight face. I mean, honest abortion advocates fully admit that abortion takes a life. The honest ones will say that abortion takes a life, but as the former president of NARAL put it, it's a life worth sacrificing. In other words, it's either the child or my happiness, my fulfillment, my mental peace, or whatever. But we're seeing this across the board, and we're also seeing that the courts are in some cases sustaining these practices, either overturning states that have put abortion services in the non-essential category, or stopping other attempts at it. But again, it's another example of the opportunism of calamity and instability where evil advances.
Well, in arguing that abortion services have to remain open during the pandemic, governors like in Michigan have called them essential services. They made the case that these are essential medical services, right? This is a life-sustaining operation. My question for them right off the bat with that is, why, if these are essential services, do pro-choice advocates argue so vehemently against laws requiring admitting privileges to local hospitals? Why do they argue against proposed laws that would hold abortion doctors to the same medical standards of, sanitation and just general,
just state level legislative, things that try to put some level of regulation. But again, it's because we've said before, the days of safe, legal, and rare are not only over, they've been over for a long time, and that the standard central place where pro-abortion advocates and the most of the Democratic Party lands is that abortion now is no longer something that's a necessary evil, but it's a positive good that needs to be advanced and protected at all costs. And by the way, one of the things that we've also lost sight of, Shane, as we're talking about this, is that the Supreme Court continues to deliberate and will continue to issue decisions. And one of the decisions that many people are waiting for is what they're going to do with this Louisiana law, which effectively, required admitting privileges, something identical to what happened in Texas, but a very different situation on the ground than Texas. And so what are they going to do with this? And, there's going to be some precedent set or overturned in this decision, and it's going to be a very important decision, something we should be praying for even right now.
Yeah, and of course we have a conservative majority on the court, and I find it very hard to make the case that abortion is the equivalent of, a plastic surgery center when it comes to the standards it should be held to legally, but then it's also life-saving services, it's also vital life-sustaining surgery. Yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation this past week, Shane, on having to do with the other end of life as well. And it became even more appropriate. But one of my former professors, when I was a Trinity student, Dr. Ben Mitchell, probably the preeminent Southern Baptist bioethicist in America, has written a lot on various bioethical issues, but especially on the end-of-life care and the opportunities that are in front of us right there. We had a really interesting conversation about this because, he was talking about how the fact that we can even have this conversation on the issues of abortion, and we can actually, see the courts move in at least more in a good direction than we have seen in the past. And obviously this is going to be an interesting test, what happens in this remade Supreme Court. But we were talking specifically this week as part of our short course about end-of-life care and the aging population that we have, the ability to prolong life, the ability to diminish pain, the ability to end life, the legal capacity, and the legal advance of euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide. And it was really just fascinating. In fact, even this week, doctors in the Netherlands took another step, towards death, where patients with severe dementia who had previously requested euthanasia can be euthanized, even if they can't give consent then. So, think about somebody making a decision 20 years ago and then basically declining to the point. But when? Where's that line? Can a patient say, when I, cross this line, this line, this line? And one of the things that Dr. Mitchell mentioned that was so powerful this week is just something we've got to think about, and something that this time in history is affording us, is a time to actually deal with. We talked about a Christian worldview. We need a Christian worldview of death and dying, and many of us just don't have it. And we know that we have this mixed relationship, as he put it, with death. Death's the enemy, and yet death is not the victor. Death is a way to be with Christ, as Paul said, and yet death is not the way it's supposed to be. Death is a foe, but it's a defeated foe. And so all these things require some deep reflection. It just made me think, look, as Christians who need to be properly grounded in the gospel to face this cultural moment, we're going to have to know how to think and deal with death. And that's just not something that many pastors preach about. There's not a whole lot of small group studies, in our Christian bookstores about, let's have a 6-week study on death and dying. But it was actually part of Christian catechism and Christian prayers for a long time. And it's something that's really missing. So maybe that's a topic we'll have to come back to in future weeks.
Yeah, John, just going back to the secular aspect of it for a minute, though. You don't even have to be a Christian to recognize that there is a slippery slope here. And this is a new Rubicon, the stretching of the concept of consent. So previously in the Netherlands, we had people who weren't even suffering in a physical sense. It was severe emotional anguish, where we've seen a number of cases of doctor-assisted suicide for people who are, mentally ill or who are depressed or who have, severe mental distress. Now we're moving to the next step. We're euthanizing people who at some point have given an indication that they would be okay with it, but can't presently consent to it. The next step beyond that, of course, is determining, so sort of a board of doctors, a death panel, if you will, determining that this person no longer has adequate quality of life and should be mercifully euthanized. And this is the slippery slope that conservatives have pointed to on this issue for decades now. And it's unfolding right before our eyes in the Netherlands. I think anyone who does not take that seriously, even from a secular perspective, even from a pro-euthanasia perspective, is not dealing with the issue as it actually exists in the real world. Well, John, thanks so much. It's just been a great conversation on a lot of different topics this week. We had a full schedule, but we got to most of the important stories. Folks, come to breakpoint.org to find links to all the stories and articles that we mentioned today on the program. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks so much for listening.
Well, those of you that listen to the podcast are getting an extended version of BreakPoint this week. And there's one more thing that we didn't have time to cover if you caught us on radio, but I think it's worth talking about. One of the historians and sociologists that I have respected the most for a long time is Philip Jenkins. He's the author of a really classic work on, I guess, the future of Christianity. It's called The Next Christendom, and he was one of the first to really argue that the center of gravity of the Christian church is moving south and moving out of the West.
And I used that title earlier in the podcast, if you caught it, John.
Oh, you did? Which one? The Next Christendom?
The Next Christendom, yeah.
Oh, man. I should listen when you say stuff.
I put that Easter egg down for you, and you didn't even pick it up.
Oh, man, yeah. Well, listen, hey, I'm picking it up now because I'm, for the record, the one who saw this article, and am sending it to you for us to talk about. So you can pat yourself on the back all you want, homeschooler, but here we go. No, listen, this is it's a fascinating thing. And let me put it in context, Shane. There's kind of a myth that we like to tell ourselves about the church as Christians, is that the church always does well in hard times. And the reason is because the church often did well in hard times. And we love that quote from Tertullian that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, as long as it's not our blood, right? I mean, that's one thing. But the other thing is it's just not true, historically speaking. The church did grow at times of persecution, at some times of persecution, and it also shrunk at other times of persecution. And some would argue, and many did, that shrinking at certain times of persecution actually you purified it. And of course, this is the sort of thing that the Apostle Paul talks about. Well, Jenkins is going out on a limb here, and as Yogi Berra said, it's dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future. And this is an attempt to try to figure out, okay, what's the church going to look like in the West, in particular, not exclusively coming out of the coronavirus. And we have talked about really wonderful stories of Christians doing amazing things. And we have also expressed, and I've begun expressing it even more, that while I'm seeing on social media a lot of Christians missing going to church together, I wonder, if, I don't know, maybe it was this moment on another podcast where I heard this pastor essentially say, if somebody can get at home the same thing they can get at church. And then he went on to say, except being together. And I thought, well, if that's all there is the difference, people can get together with their neighbors and their friends or their family, or they don't want to get together. And if it's all about what you want and what you get out of it, then there's going to be an awful lot of people that choose, online church. It's not unlike what we saw with liberal Christianity, right? Where liberal mainline denominations sound just like NPR on Sunday mornings. Why go to church?
Why not just listen to NPR and sleep in?
And have slippers and your coffee, as so that's one of the things that he talks about, as he put it in the very first prediction he makes, is the further decline of institutional faith. And has both to do with individualism, but also I think that, we talked about the church becoming a non-essential service, and abortion services are an essential service. I think for many Christians, the church is a non-essential service in their own understanding of their own faith. And if that's the case for us, we shouldn't be too surprised when government officials make the same, conclusion.
Yeah, and then the pattern he suspects is going to unfold here in the wake of social isolation and the coronavirus is that people's habits of going to church, which were already so fragile and tenuous, are now going to be disrupted. And we're going to see people actually asking themselves, why should I go back to church? What does it offer me that I can't get at home? Because this was already the weakest aspect of our theology as American Christians. I shared last week on the program that stats tell us about north of 70% of Americans still identify as Christian, and they'll make Christian statements. But only a little more than 30% actually attend church regularly, and regular church attendance even has become a shifted goalpost. It's now defined as, something like at once a month.
Yeah, it's once a month.
This is an attack on our weakest area theologically.
Right. And this goes through the larger context that goes, at least 20 years past this, which he also mentions, which is Robert Putnam's idea in Bowling Alone, that more people are bowling, fewer people are joining bowling leagues. And one of the other predictions he makes is that predictions of another revival are probably wrong. And this is where we're going to get emails this week, Shane, I'm sure, because I have seen that. I have seen people say more people are watching our online service center than we ever had before, which is a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's not enough. It's not a sufficient condition. That's kind of like the World Tennis Association saying, more people are playing tennis because they have Wii, like they're doing Wii tennis. So therefore tennis is, going to be an ascending sport. There was Wii tennis before there was Wii basketball or Wii badminton, everything except Wii bowling, but it didn't actually, lift the status of professional tennis. And that's, I guess, my concern is that when I hear other fellow believers, and, there was a piece, he talks about this piece in the Wall Street Journal that actually made this kind of prediction that this could be another, turning to God. I think the potential's there, but the potential's there like it was at 9/11, right? Where all these people went back to church after 9/11 until they stopped going to church. And so now the question is this going to drive people to church? It might drive just as many people to online church than to real church. And is there something long-term here? One of the things he points out too, Shane, and this came up in our conversation in the short course. I want to get your thoughts on this because it's fascinating. And I've had this conversation with the clergy at my own church, including one who actually works with chaplains around America, that One of the things that grew faith after World War I, when many people were predicting that it would end faith or greatly diminish faith, like all the other wars of the 19th century did in Europe. But after World War I, it went the other direction. Why? And one of the things that Jenkins argues here is that it had to do with the courage of the priest and the pastors and the clergy on the front lines, going and serving. But in this whole pandemic, those are people that have not been able to be on the front lines in the same way. And I tell you what, I've got pastor friends, again, the clergy in our church. I mean, they're just heartbroken about it because they know this is where they belong. And they know not only do they belong there, but not only can they not be there, but family members can't be there. And we've got an epidemic of people dying alone. This is one of those things that I think changes us profoundly as a community.
Well, of course, the bright spot in all this, if there is one, is the void that's going to be opened up in people's lives in the absence of organized religion. Because we are, as Calvin put it, or Augustine first put it, we're religious creatures. And Calvin said our hearts are idol factories because we got to worship something. But I think there's going to be a void in the wake of this because people needed an acknowledgement communally of the supernatural. They need to understand that there is something higher that gives their lives meaning. And you even see this with atheists, John. You even see them making transcendent statements about the universe that don't make any sense. Like, Lawrence Krauss saying, well, we're made of star stuff. And so that's a concept that should leave us in awe. Well, why? He doesn't explain. But he says it should leave us in awe. And Carl Sagan does the same thing. But people need this. And they're going to replace it with something if they don't get it at church. But that also means that this is an opportunity for Christians who understand the Christian worldview and then the natural framework on which it's based, how we're created, why we exist, and why we have the desires we do, to explain to people, look, you're looking for something supernatural. You're looking for something transcendent. You're looking for meaning in your life. Well, I know what the meaning is. And there's an institution that God has ordained where we come together as a people to receive his redeeming love in Christ and, renew our true humanity.
But this is a case for apologetics. This is a case right here, Shane, for apologetics, because this is probably the place where I disagreed with Philip Jenkins in his article, because he said here that he doesn't think that this will lead to a growth in like pseudo-religions, new agey healing cults.
It has to.
Look, Sarah Henlicky Wilson wrote this years ago in a piece in First Things called Talking to Generation X. Now, again, she was talking about the spiritual characteristics of Gen X. And she said, be careful, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she said, be careful of trying to attract us with all the spiritual and mysterious, because you won't have enough to fulfill our appetites. G.K. Chesterton said, when you stop believing in God, it's not that you stop believing in anything. It's that you will believe in anything, right? That's the real problem. And that our appetites will live for that experience rather than the truth of that experience. And if there's not any sort of kind of catechism of argumentation, of rational, reasonable, articulate clarity, this whole system put together, not just here's what Christianity can do for you in this time of need, but this is what Christianity is, and therefore you can find an anchor for your soul. Those are two very different ways of approaching evangelism and discipleship and, reach out at a time like this. So, and then you kind of look across the board and you say, is which one of those two things characterizes the church right now? Is it here's what Christianity is, you can find an anchor for your soul? Or is it, here's what's in it for you? Jesus can be your best friend and he'll never leave you or forsake you. All of which is true, of course, but it's not grounded in any larger context. And so I do think it's a starter drug for a lot of kind of pseudo-religions or pseudo-religions become kind of alternatives and just close your eyes and point, whatever works for you.
Yeah, and Christianity has conquered a lot of pseudo-religions. The thing I'd love to see, John, is maybe a book or a lecture series on exactly what it looks like for a culture to get re-evangelized, reconverted. Because looming large in my thinking are all these initial conversions of pagan Europe to Christianity. But I wonder, what does it look like to go back to your first love, to come back to Christianity and say, to hear that voice that says, take up and read, and then find your soul's true home in the God of the Bible, in the God of Christianity.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating article, and we're always in the debt of Philip Jenkins for the scholarship that he puts out, and the wisdom that he offers. Even if you disagree, you're disagreeing with something very important. And I and it's kind of like saying, I think C.S. Lewis was wrong on this. Like, I might think that, but I'm probably going to lose in the end. So I say that as well with Philip Jenkins, because he's just contributed so much to helping the church think about itself in this cultural moment. And so I really recommend this piece, which is posted over at the Anxious Bench on Patheos. And we'll link to that again with so many other things. And by the way, this whole conversation of what it means for the church to be the church right now is front and center what we're going to be talking about in our upcoming Truth, Love Together live event. This is kind of the online replacement for Wilberforce Weekend, which, as we've acknowledged, is wonderful because we've got far more people already signed up to be a part of this event than we could have ever accommodated at the live event. And yet, as we've acknowledged several times, Shane, it's not the same because there's a lot of friends. There's a lot of people. Right. The Colson Center is a family. There's a whole lot of people that go back generations with Chuck Colson, and that go back 3 months ago when they found a BreakPoint commentary, and them and their families now are talking about the content at the dinner table. And that's one of the best parts. Is seeing everyone, and that's one of the worst parts of having to move this online, is missing that deep relational connection that we have. But we don't want you to miss this online conference. It's going to be rolled out over a series of several weeks. Each module, there's 5 modules, have 3 primary speakers and a bonus session. The sessions, module 1, we're going to be talking about what is truth. How do we define truth in this cultural context? In spite of the cultural context is a better way to put that. Secondly, the second module is what is love. The third one is how do we become people of truth and love. The fourth one is how do we speak the truth in love? That's kind of the skill set session. How do we actually become the people that can do this well? And then the final session is how do we love the victims of lies by telling the truth? And we'll be it's just an incredible lineup. Oz Guinness, Lee Strobel, Johnny Erickson Tata, Uji Ekiosha. I mean, just come to our website and we will link you to Truth, Love Together. You don't want to miss that time together. It's going to be great. The rollout of this is May 16th, so we've got just a little bit less than a month before we launch that event, but we're taking signups right now, and it's filling up, which is fantastic. Good news is when I say it's filling up, there's a lot of people signing up, but we don't have a lid. Like, there's not a capacity, which is terrific. And maybe by that point, and I think by that point, there will at least be some larger extended family communities, maybe some youth groups, maybe some church small groups who could experience this content together. Who knows? In some parts of the country, it's a long way away. In coronavirus years, it's a long way away. So we'll see what happens. But it'll be live streamed right to you. It actually won't be live it's pre-recorded, so there won't hopefully be any technical glitches in terms of dropped audio or disappearing, speakers. But it's a terrific lineup, and we want to make sure you guys catch it. So come to the website. You can sign up for the Truth, Love Together virtual event.
Yeah, we're real excited about it. Well, thanks for listening, folks. This has been BreakPoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet. Join us again next week to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Thanks for listening.